Here we go. So this is from last week. My son and I were in Alaska. That's Josh, my youngest son, and this is him staring out at Mount Healy Overlook in Denali National Park. And let's just take a moment and enjoy the beauty, experience the beauty here of the beautiful Alaskan mountain peaks. This here is a glacier outside of Palmer, Alaska, that had carved itself a beautiful ice cave. Again, beautiful. One more picture of nature beauty. This is us. There's Josh and I. This is outside of Palmer. Again, just great vistas everywhere you look in Alaska. Beautiful. And then, of course, this was on Monday, my Monday morning run. This is kind of more everyday beauty right here in South Florida. This is up in Jupiter Farms. But not only do you have the sunset every morning, which is wonderful, kind of cresting in the morning, but you just have the kind of ordinary everyday beauty, the charm of life, the a well-planned neighborhood kind of beauty that I was enjoying this Monday. So I thought I'd snap a picture and share it with you. I took a selfie, but you don't want to see me as well. And then, of course, I love Erica's talk, right? Because there's the beauty as we turn our gaze to the heavens above. And this is one of my favorite pictures from an observatory down in Chile of the Milky Way galaxy. So we have beauty everywhere around us in nature. But it's not just nature. We also see beauty in art. So just for a minute, attune to the beauty of the stained glass window, or maybe just your place in this room, the architecture, the sense of place that it creates, or even the different sculptures around. Oh, thank you. And now a little more awkward, look around at each other. Because you are beautiful too, right? I see some husbands and wives and others, yes, nodding. Human beauty, it's all around us, right? And so what we've done, and just for a moment, is we reflected on 4 of the 5 kinds of beauty that artists, or that philosophers, theologians, and others talk about. We've looked at nature beauty just a little bit. We've experienced the beauty that you find in art. We've talked about the beauty of human beauty, the everyday charm kind of beauty, and just that is part of the charm of life. And of course, there's divine beauty that we'll talk about as well. These are the 5 kinds of beauty that people often talk about. So I want to move from just our experience of beauty to a couple claims about beauty. And we'll start with low culture, and then we'll move to high culture here. So let me start with one of our family's favorite series, which is The Office. I'm sure you've all at least seen some of The Office, right? Now, I had never watched the entire series from start to finish until the COVID year. And that COVID year, this was like the thing that got our family through COVID. We just watched from the first episode, first season, all the way to the end. And it's funny, it's crass, but it's all those things as well. But if you hang in there to the very last episode, you have a deeply theological point about beauty. And in fact, it's not just the last episode of the season finale, but it's the last words of the entire show. And the last words are given to Pam Halpert, the character here, and it's something deeply profound. She says, and this was the last thing in the whole series, "I think an ordinary paper company like Dunder Mifflin was a great subject for a documentary. There's a lot of beauty in ordinary things. Isn't that kind of the point?" It's really provocative, and it's actually quite profound for The Office. There's a lot of beauty in ordinary things, and isn't that kind of the point? All right, so we'll go to high culture here. This is Oscar Wilde. Has anybody read The Picture of Dorian Gray? Couple? Okay, good. Yeah, so here you have, I think that Oscar Wilde in this book, the Picture of Dorian Gray, helps us to see the mysterious yet evocative nature of beauty, and also the interplay of beauty with art and the imagination and understanding. So in this story, right in the beginning, you have Basil Hallward, who had painted a masterpiece of this guy, Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray was a beautiful person. And the painting was such a good painting that you couldn't tell the difference between the person and the painting. As Oscar Wilde describes it, they were a perfect type, right? So they were a beautiful person and a beautiful painting. Now, the young Dorian Gray is unaware of his beauty, and so another character in the story begins to point out to Dorian Gray his beauty. He said, this character is named Lord Henry, and he says this to Dorian Gray. He says, "You have a beautiful face, Mr. Gray. Don't frown. You have." But then Lord Henry moves from an instance of beauty to theorizing about beauty itself. And that's the big quote there that I have. Listen to what he says about beauty. And look at some of the kinds of claims he makes about beauty. He says, and beauty is a form of genius, is higher indeed than genius, as it needs no explanation. It is of the great facts of the world, like sunlight or springtime, or the reflection in dark waters of that silver shell we call the moon. It cannot be questioned. It has its divine right of sovereignty. It makes princes of those who have it. You smile. Ah, when you have lost it, you won't smile. People say sometimes that beauty is only superficial. That may be so, but at least it is not so superficial as thought is. To me, beauty is the wonder of wonders. It is only the shallow people who do not judge by appearance. The true mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible. Okay, so here we have high, but somewhat confusing praise of beauty, right? On the one hand, we read that beauty is one of the great facts of the world, right? It's the kind of thing that's the wonder of wonders. It's the kind of thing that is a true mystery. And of course, that's exactly right? This seems correct. Beauty is something of great value. It's evocative, yet it's deeply mysterious. But we also have some confusing claims here as well, right? He says that it needs no explanation, and it cannot be challenged, right, or cannot be questioned. And I don't quite know what he's getting at with this idea that it's not as superficial as thought, right? So these are kind of confusing things that Oscar Wilde probably is reminiscing or thinking about beauty. But all of this is really suggestive, I think, right? And so important questions remain. And this is what I want to do here is I want to explore two questions based on these observations of our experiences of beauty as well as claims that people have made about beauty. I want to explore first a little bit about the nature of beauty. I just want to ask that question, what is beauty? And then secondly, once we've spent some time drilling into the details of what beauty is, we want to ask that question, what does it reveal about ultimate reality? Okay? So there it is. Let's begin, as a philosopher usually does, with some basics. Okay, so remember this claim that beauty is one of the great facts of the world. So here's one way to get at this. Okay, so think about, I love Erica's talk. You know, she's throwing out all these physical facts about the world, right? Certain facts about the charge of an electron or the mass of an atom, facts about the temperature here in Florida, facts about how many chairs are in this room. These are physical facts. And nobody doubts that there are physical facts in the universe, right? We traffic in them all the time. I would argue, and I would want to argue, that just as there are physical facts, so too there are moral facts in the universe. And we can appeal to, just through the light of reason, these kinds of truths that we can see as moral facts. For example, that honesty is a virtue, or that rape is wrong, racism is wrong, things like this, right? So just as there are physical facts, there are moral facts. My claim here, though, is just as there are physical facts and moral facts, there are also aesthetic facts. Right? It's part of the furniture of the world. So in other words, let me switch the language from talk about facts to talk about things. Okay? So then the claim would be that there are beautiful things in the world, right? And we can enumerate them. We can think about, like Lord Henry, he talked about the moon and the sun, for example. We could think of the awe-inspiring majesty of the Rocky Mountains or the Alaskan mountain range. We could think of that well-planned urban park here in West Palm. We could think of the beauty of a Texas sunset, or the elegance of a dance move, or the sublimity of a batter's swing, or the grandeur of Bach's toccata and fugue in D minor, or the sublimity of the Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, or the sophistication of the laws of nature, Einstein's field equations, or even the beauty of a logical proof. Come back to that. Now, okay, so the claim is that beautiful things are part of the furniture of the world, and so beauty is part of the furniture of the world, right? It exists out there in reality. In the same way that physical things do and moral facts exist, there are beautiful facts. Now, there is an objection that is popularly advanced at this point, and you've probably heard it phrased as something like, well, isn't just beauty in the eye of the beholder? Has anybody heard this before, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, okay? Now, this is an objection that finds its roots in this guy. This is David Hume. And he famously said that beauty is no quality in things themselves, right? So he would disagree with what I just said. that there are beautiful things in the world. It merely exists in the mind which contemplates them. And each mind perceives a different beauty. One person may even perceive deformity where another is sensible of beauty. And every individual ought to acquiesce in his own sentiment without pretending to regulate those of others. So this is a provocative claim, and there's actually a nugget of truth in this, but it's also deeply flawed. And so I want to kind of pull out both the nugget of truth and the deeply flawed piece of this. So contra to claims that, like David Hume makes, or this idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I actually think that's false. I don't think beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But I want to make a distinction that helps us understand that a little bit. So first, let me give you two reasons to think why beauty is actually an objective feature of the world. Okay? Not just something in our minds, but an objective or great fact of the world. And I'll just kind of quickly roll through these, right? So one reason to think that beauty is a part of the furniture of the world is from the reality of aesthetic agreement and disagreement, right? So consider that list of beautiful things that I mentioned a moment ago, or consider the experiences of beautiful things in this room, in those pictures earlier that we had. Now, I suspect, and you'll need to confirm this for yourself, that we all largely agreed that we were experiencing beautiful things, right? And that is suggestive of the fact that beauty is a mind-independent reality. Moreover, we can be wrong in our aesthetic judgments, as Ethel tells me all the time, right? We can be wrong about things that are beautiful, right? And so I love, this is Peter Forrester. He's a philosopher who's written a lot on beauty, and he kind of imagines someone who adopts this view called aesthetic relativism, the idea that beauty is merely in the eye of the beholder. And he kind of pulls out the kind of absurdity of that claim. Imagine someone saying how ugly the stars are tonight, how trivial the pounding of the waves on the beach. And is it not crass to be thrilled by the mountains? The rainforest and the wildflowers are quite repulsive. And as for sunsets, ... That sounds wrong, right? Now, if aesthetic relativism is actually true, it might sound odd, but it's strictly speaking not wrong to say something like that, right? He goes on to say, if full-blown relativism in aesthetics were correct, then those responses would be unusual, but not in any way improper. And his point, but my reaction is that anyone who fails to appreciate the beauty of the universe is defective. Natural beauty has as much a claim to the objective features of this universe as do colors, sounds, and so forth on which it is based. So there's wide agreement on matters of beauty, along with the possibility of genuine disagreement. And that provides good reasons, contrary to Hume, to think that beauty is an objective feature of the world, okay? Secondly, though, there's something that's called the indispensability argument. And this is kind of interesting. I teach philosophy, and when we do theory building in philosophy, and science would be the same way, when we do theory building and we develop these models, we look at these models, we look at these theories, and if they have certain theoretical virtues, the more theoretical virtues they have, the more we think that is probably true, because theoretical virtues are truth indicative, right? What's interesting, though, the theoretical virtues that philosophers and scientists point to are things like elegance, simplicity, empirical adequacy, coherence, and the explanatory scope and power of the theory. What's interesting, every one of those theoretical virtues that I just listed are aesthetic properties. And one commentator noted, and this is how Ellen Scarry in her book on Beauty and Being Just said, she said that beauty is allied with truth. You can't separate one from the other. And it's very provocative that if we are to assess the truth of our theories in science, in philosophy, we require aesthetic properties. They're indispensable to our theorizing. And I find that very persuasive to think that beauty is actually part of the furniture of the world. It's allied very closely to truth. Okay, so I want to just tweak that common phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I don't think that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But here's what's right, and here's what Hume got right in this, right? And it's a simple tweak. Beauty is beheld by the eye, right? It's beheld by the mind. It's beheld by the knower, right? So there is a subjective aspect to beauty, right? Our experience of beauty. Of course, it's beheld by minds, but it's an objective feature out there in the world, okay? So beauty's not in the eye of the beholder, but it's beheld by minds. It's touched by minds. It's felt and smelled by minds. All right, so beauty is an objective feature of reality. Let me give you two more features that I think will be relevant as we explore what does beauty reveal about reality. If we think about what it's like to experience beauty, the phenomenology of that experience, we notice two other things, right? First, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the experience of beauty as a kind of invitation, right? A kind of invitation to reconsider the world and our place in it. And it's actually a kind of invitation to a journey. And then secondly, this experience of beauty is pleasurable. Okay, so let me just take each of those briefly here. Let's start with the first one. So I love Ellen Scarry. She's written this book called On Beauty and Being Just. Fantastic book on beauty. And she helps us understand the evocative and mysterious structure of our perception, our experience of beauty. She says this: the beautiful thing seen is incomparable, unprecedented. And that sense of being without precedence conveys a sense of the newness or the newbornness of the entire world. It is the very way the beautiful thing fills the mind and breaks all frames that give the never before in the history of the world feeling. So the idea is that beauty arrests us, or it captivates and fills us. Plato famously said that beauty evokes desire, right? It awakens us. It nourishes us and it gives us life, right? The reality is that God created us to be nourished on the good and the true and the beautiful. This is how we've been made, right? And so there's a kind of weightiness or excellence or glory to beauty. And so a word that I'll use in a minute, there's a kind of transcendence to beauty and our experience of beauty that is actually suggestive of something infinite. Now, Ellen Scarry in this book, she goes on to say that our experiences of beauty are a small wake-up call to perception, right? They a kind of invitation. They wake us up. And then she says, we continually revise our location in order to place ourselves in the path of beauty, right? There's a kind of nourishing. There's a kind of invitation there. It functions as a kind of greeting, perhaps even from another world. Okay, so that's the first thing I want us to note about our experience, our perception. The second thing that's often noted is that the experience of beauty is inexhaustibly pleasurable. So it is pleasurable to experience beauty in all its ways, but it's unlike all the other pleasures, right? So again, here's Scarry. She says, many human desires are coterminous in their object. A person desires a good meal, and as if though by magic, the person's desire for a good meal seems to end just at about the time the good meal ends. But our desire for beauty is likely to outlast its object because, unlike all other pleasures, the pleasure we take in beauty is inexhaustible. No matter how long beautiful things endure, they cannot out-endure our longing for them. Right? So I'm craving that hamburger right now. We're going to eat sandwiches. I'm craving that sandwich right now for lunch, right? But once we eat that thing, not only will the sandwich be gone, but my longing for that sandwich will be gone. They're coterminous, right? But there's something about our experience of beauty that we can experience it in such a way that it's pleasurable, but the longing the longing outlasts the experience, right? And so I think about, like, even in our own house, the majesty of the royal palms that we have in the front of our home that are beautiful. Or we live up in Jupiter, like just the beauty of the inlet up there and the beaches. Or in teaching logic, like I actually love doing logical proofs. And the beauty of a logical proof, there's something there that's deeply mysterious and pleasurable in that. And that's one way that beauty is different. Okay, so we've attended to the phenomena of beautiful things, and we've noted, first of all, I've argued that beauty is an objective feature of the world, right? And then we've attended to the phenomena of beauty and noted that it functions as a kind of invitation, and it's inexhaustibly pleasurable. Now, Thomas Aquinas is one of my favorite theologians on beauty. There's people have been talking about beauty in the philosophical tradition and the theological tradition for as long as we've been thinking about these things. But Aquinas, I think, gets a lot of this right. Okay, so I want to just take you to three of my favorite passages from Aquinas in the Summa Theologiae, where he talks about each of these aspects of beauty. So here, Aquinas is talking about the experience of beauty, that subjective component. And notice what he says. He says, the beautiful is something pleasant to apprehend, right? So it's pleasant, it's pleasing, and it's pleasant to apprehend. Now, he's not talking just about physical or visible beauty here. This could be, the idea is that it's pleasant to apprehend with the mind, right? So this could include like the laws of nature or logical proofs or things like that. So this gets at the subjective part. But Aquinas does have something to say about the objective features of beautiful things in the world. In fact, there's a huge debate about what are the criteria for beautiful things? What kind of features do we have? Well, here's three that I find super suggestive from Aquinas. Okay, so he says, for beautiful things include three conditions, three criteria here. He says, first, integrity or perfection, since the things which are impaired are by their very fact ugly. Second, due proportion or harmony. And third, lastly, brightness or clarity, whence things are called beautiful, which have a bright color. Okay, so not exactly like the language we use, right, about these things, but here's the idea. So the first idea, integrity or perfection. The idea is that beautiful things exhibit wholeness. They're a whole such that everything is as it should be, right? When we experience beautiful things, everything is as it should be. And this creates in us a sense of rest, of wholeness. What about proportion or harmony? The idea is that every part of a beautiful thing brings out the best in every other part of a beautiful thing, creating in us a sense of joy and at-homeness, right? And then you might be wondering, what about that last one, brightness and clarity? I think a better word would be radiance. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about the radiant nature of beauty. And this is the idea that beauty communicates something transformative, even if it's veiled in mystery, right? The evocative, mysterious nature of something that feels like a kind of personal communication. So one of my favorite theologians on this is John Navone. And he says this, he says, beauty discloses or radiates, there's that word, truth and goodness of things. Therefore, it entails communication, communion, and community. Likewise, Roger Scruton, another person who writes on beauty, he says, beauty demands to be noticed. It speaks to us directly, like the voice of an intimate friend. I love even the Greek word for beauty, kalen, K-A-L-E-N, is the Greek word for call. Beauty calls, it awakens, right? All right, so we'll come back. We've got one more from Aquinas in a minute. So we've talked a little bit about the nature of beauty and noticed these features. So our next question is, what does beauty reveal about ultimate reality? Okay? So I want to begin with, this is one of my philosophy professors. Do you know Paul, Erica, from Purdue? Paul Draper? Okay, so Paul Draper is probably one of the leading atheist, agnostic philosophers in the world today. And I had an opportunity to study with him at Purdue. And in one article, Paul says that the reality of beauty does provide, notice, relatively small advantage for theism, okay? So you're kind of weighing the evidence, and he's going to concede that the fact that the universe has beautiful things in it does give some advantage to theism. But notice it's relatively small. So I agree that beauty supports theism, but maintain the overall pattern of good and evil in this world is much more probable on naturalism than on theism. So the ability of theism to explain beauty and our enjoyment of it is a relatively small advantage for theism. And then he goes on, arguments from evil against theism, of which he's actually a leading defender of these arguments, are much more powerful than the argument from beauty in favor of theism. Okay? So we have this question. Does the reality of beauty provide a relatively small advantage for theism? Or, this is Ellen Scarry, this is what she says. Now notice this, she says, one can see why beauty, by Homer, or by Plato, or Aquinas, or Dante, and the list would go on, name upon name, century upon century, page upon page, has been perceived to be bound up with the immortal. For it prompts a search for a still earlier precedent, and the mind keeps tripping backward until at last it reaches something that has no precedent, which very well may be immortal. So initially, it seems like we have a kind of competing intuitions, right? What is the evidential force of all the beautiful things? Is it relatively small for theism? Or, as many have noted through the history of our tradition, it seems like beauty is bound up in strong evidence for God. Now, we can't get into everything that Paul Draper says there, especially with respect to evil. I will say that in the book that I'm actually kind of summarizing the chapter on beauty on, I spend a whole chapter on pain and evil, and I interact with Paul Draper. So you can go read the book. I'll tell you about that at the end here. But I think that it is not the case that evil is going to undercut, or, ultimately at the end of the day, we still can consistently and plausibly hold the existence of God and the existence of evil together, right? So the question becomes, what kind of evidential force does beauty have? And what does it reveal about ultimate reality? Well, part of why I went a little deeper into the nature of beauty is I wanted to pull out some salient features of beauty that I think Draper misses, right? So he's just considering like the bare existence. If you go back to he's just considering the bare reality, the objective reality of beauty. But if you think about the phenomenology of our experience of beauty and what that tells us about what beauty is, I think we can go a little bit deeper. And I think an argument, in fact, a good argument can be made that beauty provides strong evidence, not relatively small advantage, but strong evidence for theism. And so you actually have an underutilized, but I think pretty good argument from the reality of beautiful things to the reality of God. Okay? So let me show you it. It's pretty simple. And actually, as a philosopher, we want to get clear on things. And so I'm going to just categorize the evidence from beauty into two claims, E1 and E2, evidence 1 and evidence 2. And I'm going to switch the language slightly, okay? Evidence base 1 is this fact that we've noticed that the world is saturated with evil. Well, I'm sorry, with beauty. There is evil too. But it's saturated. That was not good. Sorry, I was thinking about Paul Draper. Unfortunately, there is evil too. But the world is saturated with evil. Everywhere we turn the mind's eye, right? We find beauty. It's an objective and valuable and deep and pervasive feature of reality, right? It's abundantly found. It's found in the mathematical laws that describe our world. It's found everywhere in the starry heavens that we look, right? The 100 billion stars in this galaxy and the 100 billion galaxies that each have 100 billion stars. Everywhere you look, there is an abundance of beauty. It's on the macroscopic level, but you can go all the way down to the DNA strand, or the cell, or the microscopic, and you find beauty there too. And of course, we find it in the medium-sized stuff like us as well. The world is saturated with something of deep value. Okay, that's E1. The world is saturated with beautiful things. The second piece of evidence is this idea that beauty possesses, and I'll switch the language, a kind of transcendent quality. And the idea here, and actually theists and atheists will agree on this, is that there's something evocative. That's why I talked about this idea of it's a kind of invitation. There's something suggestive about the reality of beauty, right? And it's a puzzle. Peter Forrest, who I quoted earlier, he says that our experience of beauty suggests this infinite beauty, which again is very, provocative. So the idea is that it has this transcendent quality to it. It's radiant, it's evocative, it awakens us, it sets us on a journey, and so on. Okay? Now, taking these two pieces of evidence, and we can come back and look at these if we want during the Q&A time. Here's the argument, and it's very simple. Okay? It's actually got two premises there, and then the conclusion. And I'll read this in English, not with the E1 and the E2, right? So the fact that beauty saturates our universe and that it's transcendent and evocative is not surprising given theism. Okay? Premise 1. Premise 2. The fact that the universe is saturated with beauty and that beauty has a transcendent quality to it is very surprising given naturalism. And I'll defend each of those premises in a minute. Therefore, by this principle in logic, these two facts strongly support theism over naturalism. Okay? So if this argument is strong, we have good reasons to think that beautiful things are best explained by God. Okay? Let me explain each of those premises just briefly. So why I think that facts E1 and E2 are not surprising on theism. Okay? Well, let's start with E1, the idea the idea that the world is saturated with beauty, and that everywhere we look, we see beautiful things. Well, we can begin with just the concept of God. Right? God, by definition, is a personal being worthy of worship. Right? And so you would expect a personal being worthy of worship, were he to create anything, he would create that with great value. Right? So it would be a good world, and of course we read that it is a good world in Genesis, but it would be a world that is beautiful and deeply beautiful as well, right? Moreover, you could think about the idea of God as a creator, right? And I love what Erica said about God being creative, right? If God is the creator, well, he's a kind of, I think, and many people have noticed this, the analogy is that God is like a playful artist, right? In fact, he's the totally original artist, right? There's God, and then out of nothing, he brings the universe into being. And so God he creates, but he creates creatively, right? And so we think about God as a kind of divine artist. And then, so we would expect any universe created by God, right, on theism, will be full of beautiful things because God is a divine artist, or he's like an artist. One other sort of interesting sort of thought that's kind of in the tradition, a lot of people ask this question, like, why did God create? And one of the answers that Aquinas gives is that God creates to manifest and communicate his goodness, right? It's a classic answer there. And as Aquinas kind of unpacks this, he says that God can't simply create like individual substances or one kind of thing to manifest his goodness, but he needs to create a plurality of substances of all different levels of scale and size. And he needs to create some substances, some creatures that have minds that can apprehend the beauty and the goodness such that he can not just manifest but communicate his goodness, right? And so there's this principle that's called the Dionysian principle, but it's this idea that the goodness is diffusive of itself, that it just wants to produce. It wants to produce good things, beautiful things, right? So we would expect, given who God is and his desires to create a good universe that manifests his glory and communicates it to him, that it has this transcendent quality and that the world is saturated. Okay, that's just premise one. Those two facts are not surprising on theism. Let's go to premise two. These two facts are very surprising given naturalism. Well, if you think about it, okay, a couple of things. First of all, it's really hard to ground objective value. Of course, beauty is a kind of objective value. It's really hard to ground objective value given naturalism, right? If it's just the BBs, the atoms, the kinds of things that Erica talked about, it's really hard to get these kind of these features of the world where there's any kind of normative values and things like that. But setting that aside, just think about a human artist, right? For those of you, and I know there's some artists in this room, you know that it requires intentionality to create works of art that have beauty. And sometimes we create works of art and we miss. It's actually hard to bring things into being that are beautiful things, right? And so if naturalism is true, notice we don't have a divine agent, a playful artist, a creative creator behind it all. And so you would not expect the universe to be saturated with beauty, right? You might expect a pocket of beauty here and there, but you wouldn't expect it to permeate the entire universe because that's just not what unguided blind forces do, right? So it's very surprising, given naturalism, given this sort of analogy, that we find beauty everywhere. And moreover, this transcendent quality of beauty is really hard to explain given naturalism because it makes the world sound like a sham. And so beauty, these two facts are surprising given naturalism. All right, so there is one objection that's probably the main objection to this, and that's the evolutionary objection here. And basically, and maybe I'll just kind of summarize this, but the idea here is that we can explain naturalistically the deep abundance of beauty and even that transcendent quality if we just give an evolutionary account, right? And so it would usually go something like this. The perception of human beauty, right, is natural selection's way of promoting breeding, or some variation of that. The perception of natural beauty is natural selection's way of promoting our attention or our ancestors' attention to environments conducive to life, such as lush landscapes that have water and fruit and berries and things like that. And then the perception of artistic beauty, there's all these sort of reasons that are offered on the evolutionary account for why we would have artistic beauty. And they're usually things like, well, it promotes group cohesion, it's conducive to cooperation and therefore our survival and things like that. Now, unfortunately, all of those explanations, and there's many like that, I don't think explain all the cases of our perception and experience of beauty. So for example, think of human beauty, right? Human beauty is not always connected to being sexually attracted, right? Think of an infant or a child that's beautiful. Or the perception of natural beauty. That's not always wed to environments that are conducive for survival. I mean, that's pretty beautiful there, but it's pretty, that desert, right? But that's not conducive to survival. So too with like the Arctic, right? Or even like the beauty of that tiger, right? There's a perception of beauty there, but you don't probably want to go pet that tiger and things like that, right? Because that wouldn't be conducive to your survival. When it comes to artistic beauty, right? It's true that things like music can promote group cohesion, they can bring us together, but it's also equally true that they can pull us apart. So for example, Charles Manson cited Helter Skelter by the Beatles as the main motivation for committing all the murder that he committed, right? So it's not the case that these things are always conducive to our survival. So we could talk more about that, but that's the main objection to this argument from beauty to God. But I don't think it explains deep enough the reality of these features of our lives. Okay? So with that, let me just say a few concluding thoughts, and we'll have some time to discuss. Let me go to the third thing that Aquinas says. So Aquinas has talked about our subjective experience of beauty, and then he's given us some criteria for beauty. But now he's going to locate that beauty theologically, right? And I love this. He says, the beauty of a creature is nothing other than the likeness of divine beauty participated in things. Okay? Now I love this. The way that you can think about this is you have these distinctions. We have the distinction of the experience of beauty and beautiful things, and then beauty itself. Here he's talking about beauty itself. That God is fundamental beauty and everything else is derivatively beautiful in virtue of participating in the divine, right? This is why, like in Florida, we say things like, that key lime pie was divine, right? And even Publix key lime pie is really good, right? But notice there's actually like a deep theological truth to that because it's derivatively beautiful in virtue of participating in the divine beauty itself. Or even go back to the wonderful quote by The Office at the end, right? The whole point of this documentary about a paper company is that there's beauty in ordinary things. That's actually a deep theological truth, right? Because everything that exists, everything that has being is good and beautiful. And so because it participates in goodness itself or beauty itself, which is God. Okay? So I love that. I love how that ties all together. Let me, since we had Michael Ward here, let me just give C.S. Lewis our last word. C.S. Lewis in The Weight of Glory, this is one of my favorite quotes there, but notice this distinction, right? We have that distinction between the experience of beauty, beautiful things, and beauty itself. You see that here as well. Right? He says, the book or the music in which we thought the beauty was located, that's the beautiful thing, will betray us if we trust in them. It was not in them, it only came through them. And what came through them was longing, right? So beauty awakens longing because it awakens our longing for beauty itself. This is one of my favorite quotes from Augustine in Book 3 of the Confessions. He says of God, he says, you are the beauty of all beautiful things. That's exactly right. He also goes on to say, you are the good of all good things, and I would just add the truth in which all true things point. Okay, so listen to beauty's call. That's my encouragement to you, especially in the busyness of like a conference like this. Take time to listen to beauty's call and then hear it and then allow God, who is the divine artist, to call you home. All right, so what I just summarized is a chapter in that book. 11 clues to understanding your place in it. And one of my favorite chapters was the one on beauty because there's just such a rich tradition that we are not always aware of in there. And so if you want more of the whole story of how this all fits together, you can check that out at the back. So, okay, that's all I've got. And I forget how much time we have, 20 minutes maybe, something like that. So let's take some time for questions. And I think Andrew's going to get a thing.
Thank you so much. First of all, Publix, key lime pie bears a distant analogy to divine beauty. It's just distant, but it's an analogy all the same. So
yes.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
I want to know if you would help me formulate an objection that's at the dancing around my mind about the objection to the evolutionary argument. There's something about, and I'm not sure exactly how to formulate this, it seems like that the evolutionary objection that it seems to confuse any utility we might have with beauty itself. It seems to me something like that beauty is really an end. It's not merely a means. And I'm not sure exactly if that's a legitimate objection, a response to the objection, or just wonder if you could expand on that or just say, no, you're on the wrong track entirely.
Yeah, so not exactly sure if I understand the question, but there is an important distinction, and like this is found in Plato, between things that are good in themselves and things that are good for the benefit they bring. And then there's this third kind of value, things that are both good in themselves and for the benefit they bring. And partly what's going on in the evolutionary accounts, it's not that beauty is good in and of itself. It's really hard to ground something being valuable objectively so in and of itself. So you have to give an instrumentally value. It's like push-ups, right? They're not good in and of themselves. They're good for the benefit they bring. And that's the kind of structure of the evolutionary objection, right? It's conducive for survival, or it's a byproduct of something that is conducive for survival, right? And so there's two things, there's two worries, and there's two reasons at least why I don't think then the evolutionary objection works. One is because it's locating beauty as instrumentally valuable when I think it's objectively a feature of the world that is deeply valuable, right? It's one of the great facts of the world. The second question is the just so stories about how this is instrumentally valuable don't, I think, go deep enough, or they don't account for all cases of beauty. And that points to the issue about the fact that the world is saturated with beauty, right? It might explain parts of the world and parts of our experiences of beauty, but I don't think it can get everything. Did that at all get to some of what you're worrying? Okay, awesome.
Well, Dr. Gould, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really, really great. Question I wanted to ask, so we talked a lot about certainly natural beauty and things like that, but I've been thinking a great deal about the aesthetic tradition within Christianity and how, historically Christians have created some of the most beautiful architecture, art, and music in the world. And sadly, it seems like that tradition is something that is largely lost within the Christian world today, but I suspect that it is something that, is very, very important, and we don't appreciate enough the value of Christians creating beautiful things. So what do you think is the apologetic value of Christians creating beautiful things, and how can we reclaim that tradition?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's interesting, and you know this because I know you're reading this book, but in my book, Cultural Apologetics, I talk about three universal longings of the human soul, the longing for goodness, truth, and beauty that find their source in Christ, right? And each of those longings has like a guide, right? Reason guides us to the object of its longing, which is truth. The conscience guides us to the object of its longing, which is goodness. And the imagination guides us to the object of its longing, which is beauty. And that's partly why we have speakers in this conference. You notice we're not just talking about the plank of reason. We're talking about these other planks as well, including the imagination. I think that this is how God has made us. And, even like Michael Ward's talk last night, and he mentioned the blue flower, right? C.S. Lewis's first encounter with beauty in Surprised by Joy, he says at that moment at 6, he became a votary of the blue flower, right? So what does that mean? He became a devotee, that's the votary. And the blue flower is like this mythic symbol in German Romantic literature that symbolizes like something of intense longing that propels us forward, right? So I think that the aesthetic currency of our day are underutilized in apologetics, and something that our culture is very interested in because of the transcendent nature of beauty, right? So all we need to do is connect the dots between our love of beautiful things in art, in nature, whatever, to the source of beauty itself, right? And so I think that there's a lot of really cool work going on. And I will say, just two more things. It's true that beauty has largely been in exile in the church, right, for years, and there's kind of an interesting story about that. And so we don't really know what to do with beauty as Christians, often, at least evangelical Christians, I should say. Because we're very pragmatic and it's all about utility, not about spending lots of money for a beautiful setting like this, that it actually changes how we experience the world. But I will say that beauty is kind of coming back in some really encouraging way. There's lots of people that are talking and thinking about this. There's organizations, like for example, I'm thinking of like the Anselm Society out of Colorado Springs, that their specific goal is to bring beauty back into the church. And they use the language of re-enchanting the church. You've got people writing. Jeremy Begbie is a theologian who is a musician, and he's writing at this intersection of faith and art. And so there's so all that to say, there's some encouraging things that are happening in this area. And I will say, though, I do a lot of speaking on that cultural apologetics book, and probably more often than not, the thing that people want me to speak on is beauty, art, and the imagination. So I think that people are becoming awake to, it's so central to our lives, so wouldn't we want to have a rich theology of beauty and art and the imagination? So, is that good?
Hello, Dr. Gould. Thank you for your presentation. I learned a lot from it. I have a question about the fallacy of understated evidence that Paul Draper develops. Basically, when you consider certain facts broadly and understate the evidence, they seem to support theism, but then when you drill down into the specifics, they seem to support naturalism. So the form that could take in this case would be to point out that there is a lot of aesthetic beauty in the world, but there's also a lot of aesthetic ugliness, so rot and decay. Mm-hmm. And theism would predict almost entirely beauty, but naturalism would predict a combination of those. So I could see someone arguing that when you consider the evidence in totality, it actually supports naturalism over theism. So I'm wondering what you would say to that.
Yeah, I mean, actually, you've done a really good job of, in a nutshell, summarizing Draper's main argument. In fact, when I was a grad student there, he gave his job talk. So he took over the chair for the post for William Rowe, who was probably one of the leading defenders of the problem of pain, the problem of evil. He was an atheist. And so Paul Draper's job talk, though, was why I am not a theist. And what was interesting, he did exactly that. He said, well, here's some things on the, that evidential force for theism, and I just think it's outweighed in this way. And he kind of would do that, all things considered, which is exactly how we do theory construction, right? All things considered. We want to go where we have empirical fit and adequacy and elegancy and all those things. So that's exactly the right way to think about it. My brief sort of claim here, especially with respect to beauty, though, is that Paul is underappreciating the evidence, right, about what beauty is. And that's partly why I wanted to look at the phenomenology of beauty and what that suggests to us. I think that he doesn't talk about it much. It's like a couple paragraphs in this essay. He talks about beauty. But he doesn't really consider the nature of beauty. And so I think that's important there. You do raise, though, the problem of the ugly, which is analogous to the problem of evil. So you have beauty and ugly, and then you have good and evil, right? And they are analogous problems. And I would just want to say in the same way that we have reasonable theistic replies to the problem of evil, we're going to tweak those and have the same kind of replies to the problem of ugly. But you're right, it's a longer story. And I would want, it takes some time to deal with that. Is that okay for now? Yeah.
Mine's kind of similar. Given that beauty apprehends us and it causes us to long, or it evokes things from us. Yeah, what sort of effect maybe would the correlative be that ugliness repulses us, or sort of? I'm even drawn to think about the way that art movements have developed into sort of applying the concept of beauty to Duchamp's The Fountain, if you know of Dadaism. It's like this, and I think it's increasing. Almost everything has beauty, and it sort of erases the distinction. So almost what effort should we make to distinguish between beauty and ugliness, if that's a...
Okay, good. There's actually at least two questions in your question, because one is about the purpose of art and what is art, right? Because you mentioned Duchamp's The Fountain, which is a 1917 kind of counter art, thing, ready-made art or whatever. So there is a question lurking in your question about what is art. And so let me just say one thing about that, and then I'll get to the other piece. There's a big debate about which question is first. There's two questions that philosophers of art debate. One, what is art? And two, what is the value of art? And some people say you need to answer the first question first to answer the second question. And other people say you need to answer the second question first to answer the first question. I hope you're following. I'm of the view that you answer the second question first in order to answer the first question, okay? So I distinguish, I think it's really hard to give definitions of anything. We could try to define that chair, and as it turns out, it's actually quite hard to define what a chair is, right? So too with art. So I think we're better to recommend what is to specify the value of art, and then from there we distinguish between good art and bad art. I would say Duchamp is art, it's just bad art. Or it's art that reflects the worldview that he's communicating and inhabits, right? I think the chief value of art is called aesthetic cognitivism. The chief value of art is that it communicates understanding. It helps us to understand the human experience of the world or the world around us in some way or God, right? It's actually called aesthetic cognitivism. And given that, I can distinguish good art from bad art as opposed to beautiful and ugly, because I don't think that all art has, and this is to your second point, I don't think all art has aesthetic qualities necessarily, right? It might have nothing aesthetic, or it might just be ugly, and I guess that is an aesthetic property too. But all art is not beautiful. The question will be, what does it communicate about our human experience of the world, about God, about the world, things like that. That's maybe what I'd quickly say. Yeah. I see we got Erica in the back and some in the back too, if you want to start working your way back that way.
I listened to another lecture on beauty, and you can tell me if you agree with this, but the lecturer was saying that beauty was, everyone agreed that beauty was objective from Plato up until the Reformation, and then when Calvin came along and the depravity of man, this idea entered that we are depraved, so we don't see beauty correctly because our souls need to be reformed by Christ. So that idea entered into society, and that's where we get beauty's in the eye of the beholder from that idea. So I guess my question is, so I'm homeschooling 4 children right now, and I'm wondering how, thanks, I try to show them truth, beauty, and goodness, and I find myself having to repent of my own bad taste, as I try to just show them beauty. So like Handel's Messiah, for example, is beautiful and objectively beautiful because many generations of humans have found it to be beautiful. So sometimes something I gravitate towards is like looking at something historically that many generations have continued to express like love for. So is there any other ways that we can repent of our bad taste? You know what I mean? Like because or is it just like the draw?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm kind of laughing because I remember we used to live in Fort Worth, Ethel and I, and we went to the art museum, the Kimball, and I know I'm supposed to enjoy art museums, and I just usually bring a book and sit in like 10 minutes. I'm in a corner, right? And so I know that I need to develop my aesthetic judgments and sensibilities in that case, in a way. And so part of it is just bringing ourselves under the gaze of beauty and being intentional, learning to see, learning to dwell. It's the kind of thing that we cultivate, right? In the same way that we cultivate our minds and our bodies when we work out or when we study, we actually can cultivate our aesthetic sensibilities, right? And part of that will be by exposing ourselves to beauty and following that thread to the source of beauty itself. But it is definitely something that, the fourth distinction I would want to make, right? So I've talked about beauty itself, beautiful things, the experience of beauty, but there is this fourth one, our judgments of beauty. And we can debate those a lot, right? And we can have different tastes and different preferences, and that's okay. That's part of our subjectivity. That's part of the subjective nature of our makeup too. Yeah, so cultivate it in the same way that we would cultivate other things. The last thing I would say, because this is kind of freeing to me on this question, because I know I don't appreciate some music that I ought to appreciate, right? Maybe, is someone. I once heard a philosopher say that she gets up, she studies virtue ethics, and she says she gets up every day and she just says, God, help me lean in the direction of the kind of person I want to be. That's actually really freeing, right? It doesn't mean that we have to have perfect aesthetic judgments or perfect connection to be nourished on the good, the true, and the beautiful, and whatever. But let's just each day lean in the direction of the kind of person that we want to be, right? We're progressors on the way. And to me, that's a kind of freeing way to like not be too uptight about that I'm not there and I'm not perfect, but just leaning in that direction. Is that okay? Is this good?
Thanks for a great talk, Paul. I have a very practical question. I've been helped on practical levels in my faith by good philosophy, so I'm looking forward to your answer on this. So when we look at how our culture views human beauty, you mentioned human beauty as well. When we look at how our culture views human beauty, it's broken, right? The representations we have of beautiful women and of handsome men are oftentimes meant to guide us into lust. What's the Christian response, given your talk about what's divinity and beauty? What is the Christian truth about how we're supposed to respond to that beauty?
Yeah, that's a great question. Good. Yeah, you're right. Because what's happening in culture is they know. So back to even Jonathan's question about like, hey, in the church, where's beauty been for all these years, and now it's kind of coming back. Part of it was the church doesn't or has not valued beauty well for so long. We value truth and maybe goodness because we care about ethics and truth, but we don't value beauty. So we have a weak theology of beauty, number one, is what I would want to say. So we have to reject anti-intellectualism and have a stronger theology of beauty. That's partly why I did that first piece. The second thing, though, is we need to understand that the culture understands beauty and is manipulating beauty to fleece our wallets and to awaken our base appetites, right? Human beauty would be one great example of that. Pornography would be, another example there. And so we need to understand we need to understand the role and function of beauty, right? It's supposed to set us on a journey that terminates in God. And so to the extent that we don't make that connection, we're going to take the good things and the beautiful things and they become an iron cage of idolatry. right? So we take the glimpses that are all around us, the moments of exhale, the moments where we experience life the way it ought to be in the experience of beauty, and if we settle for the moment, if we settle for the exhale, it becomes an iron cage from which we cannot escape. But if we allow the moment, and if we connect it theologically, if we allow the moment to set us on a journey to the source of beauty, I think at least we go some way toward not falling into the kind of misuse of like human beauty or beauty in general. Yeah, that's maybe what I want to say initially. So, yeah.
I apologize if somebody else's question kind of touched on this. It's kind of hard to keep track of
Yeah, no
all
worries.
of them. So in the same way that a doctor will try to treat a symptom by fixing the root cause instead of just treating the symptom itself, in the instance of someone who firmly believes that beauty is relative, or they truly believe that something not beautiful is beautiful, what would you say is the most common root cause of that? Is it simply a matter of clarifying definitions and identifying presuppositions, or do you think it's a direct result more commonly of like just our fallen nature?
I mean, it's all of those. That's a very complex thing. So let me just say, in the brief time that we have, what I think is probably at the root of that. So you might ask of our culture, what is the dominant way of perceiving that our culture undergoes, and what is the dominant way of thinking? And then what is the dominant way of living? And if I were to use three words, the dominant way of perceiving is what I'm going to call, and I'm just referencing, I've written on this in the Cultural Apologetic book, disenchantment. And what I mean by disenchantment is that we no longer see the world in its proper light, right? So we fall into this as Christians too, right? This is back to Erica's question. We use the same categories that pretty much everyone else does when we talk about the world. We'll use things like this world is everyday or mundane or ordinary. But that's not the way the world is, right? It's deeply mysterious. It's beautiful. To use the proper word, it's sacred. It's gift. And so theologians talk about an idolatrous way of perceiving. And that idolatrous way of perceiving is disenchantment. So part of it is we do have to begin to view the world as a sacramental universe, right? That it's an enchanted universe. It's gift. The dominant way, and I don't know how we do it on time, we need to end. So the dominant way of thinking, though, and this connects to your question, is, in a word, sensate. That we're focused on the sensory, the material, right? And I just think of like C.S. Lewis, Screwtape Letter, Senior Devil to Junior Devil, the first letter there. Senior Devil says to Junior Devil, your job is to fix the patient, their mind on the immediate stream of sensual experience. And then he says, if you do that, you'll keep them from awakening their rational faculties, and you'll keep them from pertaining to universal matters about goodness, truth, and beauty. Right? And so we are a culture fixated on the stream of sensual experience, and that's a kind of idolatrous way of thinking. And the last thing, because we're out of time, I would add to that, though, is our dominant way of living then has become hedonism. And so we're addicted to Turkish delights, to riff on Lewis, right? We go from one bite-sized episode of pleasure to another, and we're basically under a spell, right? And so complicated, but I would just point you to my book, Cultural Apologetics, and a couple chapters there. So yeah, self-plug, but I think we're done. Thank you all. Yeah.